16th century Europe was dominated by male privateers, male politics, and the desire for a male heir to every throne in Europe, with the exception of one very famous Queen of England. But aside from Elizabeth I, there was a woman who would rise far above the expectations of her sex and time. Her name was Gráinne Ní Mháille, or Grace O'Malley, and she would become known as the Pirate Queen. A quick note for everyone wondering about the name: yes, this is the woman also known as Grace O'Malley, but for this video I'll be using her real Irish name, Gráinne Ní Mháille. Apparently her nickname, Gráinne Mháille, came from an event when she was younger. Seeing her father setting off for a trading expedition to Spain, she asked if she could also come. Her father said of course she couldn't, she was a girl, but gave the reason being as Gráinne's hair was too long and would get caught in the ship's ropes. In response to this, Gráinne cut off her hair to shame her father into taking her. Gráinne Mháille, the nickname given to her, meant cropped hair. Whether the story was true or not, it was a story that embodied her personality. It's thought she was born sometime around 1530 and was likely brought up in the very heart of her family's lands in County Mayo. Her mother was Maeve Ní Mháille and her father was Owen Dovdara Mháille, the chief of Clan Mháille, or Clan O'Malley. The clans in Ireland, family and kinship groups that ruled the country within their own territories, were left mostly to their own devices under Henry VIII's government. However, this was to change over the course of Gráinne's lifetime. As a child, she would most likely have lived at her family's properties in Belclare and on Clare Island, but as a member of the Irish nobility, she may also have stayed with another noble family for at least part of her childhood. This was done to help strengthen ties between the families and also help build networks. Gráinne's family, the Mháille, were a seafaring clan that had built up great wealth and power using the coastline within their territory. Castles had been built by successive generations stretching along the coast, and this allowed them to build up a reputation for piracy and control along the north and west coast of Ireland. This allowed them to demand money from those who wished to fish in their waters, including fishermen from as far afield as England, and black rent from those who lived there, essentially rent in the payment of work, grain or meat. Although she had a paternal half-brother, Gráinne was the only legitimate child of her parents. Although early Irish law considered only male members capable of taking on the role of chief, when her father died sometime before 1570, Gráinne inherited his role and title. In 1546, when she might have been just 16, she married her first husband, Dúnal Ua Flavity. He was Tonishta, or heir to the chief of the name of Clan O'Flaherty, which made him and Gráinne a powerful political match, and together they would have ruled over much of West Ireland. They had 3 children together: Owen, the eldest son, who was said to be kind and forgiving, and these traits would lead to his later murder; Maeve, their daughter, who was apparently very much like her mother and would marry another nobleman, Richard the Devil's Hook Bourke, who actually became very close to the family. Although some sources suggest Maeve's father was actually Gráinne's second husband, and Malley, the black sheep of the family. He was known to beat his sister and refused to listen to his mother because she was a woman. However, in 1564, Dúnal found his ambition dampened when Sir Malley Ua Flaherty was instead appointed as chief of the name by Elizabeth I, leaving him without the lands he expected to rule. The following year, in 1565, things grew worse when Dúnal was ambushed while hunting and killed. This was part of a bigger picture, however, as part of a struggle against Clan Joyce for control of Castle Kirk in Loch Corrib. the property where Gráinne and Donal lived at the time. The Joyce family obviously hoped the move would intimidate Gráinne, and they went to take the castle, thinking she would back down. In the first of many unexpected moves in her lifetime, Gráinne didn't. She forced them back into a retreat, fighting them off, and keeping the castle herself. After repelling Clan Joyce, Gráinne went back to her own lands, establishing her main residence on her childhood home of Clare Island. She allegedly took a shipwrecked sailor as her lover, but sadly it didn't last very long, as he was killed by Clan Mikeoem. They clearly hadn't got the memo that Gráinne wasn't a woman to be messed with, and she attacked their main stronghold of Dough Castle at Erris. She then sent her forces to kill the murderers of her lover on Caher Island, earning her a different nickname, the Dark Lady of Dough. She would later attack their castle for a second time with her forces and take it for herself. By 1566, Gráinne had remarried, this time to Richard de Borca, known as Richard Enérin, or Iron Richard, Tonishta or designated successor to the MacWilliam Borks from County Mayo. Richard's territory lay in the barony of Burrishool, next to the Uawalia lands in Murrisk. He was himself descended from a noble Norman Irish family and had enough wealth and lands to ensure he and Gráinne made a medieval power couple to be reckoned with. They also had a son together, Tibbot Bork, who would later be made first Viscount Mayo. In 1577, Gráinne had to go through a process known as surrender and regrant for her lands, a legal process under Tudor law that converted Irish clans from a system rooted in kin and clan loyalties to one under late medieval feudalism. Crown control over Gráinne's lands was limited by the fact she was often away at sea. Lord Deputy Sir Henry Sidney was sent to meet Gráinne in Galway that year, and he sent word back describing her as a most famous feminine sea captain. She offered him the use of her 3 galleys and 200 of her men, but he didn't take her up on the offer. Not long after, she was arrested by Gerald Fitzgerald, 14th Earl of Desmond, and would spend almost 2 years in a prison in Limerick and Dublin. This was probably a move by Fitzgerald to prove his loyalty to the government, rather than any real threat posed by Gráinne. She was finally released in the spring of 1579, and a few months later her husband Richard led a raid on the Galway region as a way of splitting the crown forces there who were controlling the rebellion of Desmond. It was also a way of increasing his own military standing in his lands. Gráinne aided him in this, using her connections to help him submit to the President of Connaught, Sir Nicholas Malby, in 1580, and the raids paused. By the end of the year, Richard succeeded to the position of MacWilliam Bork, chief of his family's lands, with government support. He would even be knighted in 1581. But there was only so far the couple would go with helping the crown's reach, and records show that they both, over the next 2 years, worked together to prevent further interference from government officials in their lands. But the couple's power couldn't last forever, and in 1583, Richard died. Gráinne didn't sit around. She gathered her followers, horses and cattle, and moved to Rockfleet Castle in County Mayo, which had been on part of her late husband's land. There, she apparently continued to maintain herself and those dependent on her by both land and sea. But it wouldn't be long before Gráinne was once again in conflict. Sir Richard Bingham, an English soldier and naval commander in Elizabeth I's Navy, had been given the position of Governor of Connaught after Gráinne's first husband died. He was tasked with controlling the area and keeping control especially over the local lords who had previously enjoyed a fair amount of autonomy. At first, Gráinne and Bingham seemed to have got on fairly well, but it wasn't long before both she and her sons resisted Bingham's new regime, falling out with him irrevocably. In 1586, Gráinne's eldest son, Owen, was tricked by Sir Richard into allowing him and his forces to enter his castle. Owen was murdered by Bingham's brother, George Bingham, and the castle taken by his forces. According to many sources, Owen's younger brother, Mikeoem, joined forces with Sir Richard after his brother's death, and Gráinne disowned him for his treachery. Gráinne herself was imprisoned for a short while, and her other son Tibbot was held in Bingham's household as a pledge. In 1586 and 1588, rebellions continued despite Richard's death, continued on by his son and followers and Gráinne. Sir Bingham implicated Gráinne especially in the rebellions, accusing her of bringing Scottish mercenaries into County Mayo against government forces. But her actions were most likely a response to what was happening to her family. In 1591, Tibbot was regarded as the leading contender for the position of MacWilliam Bourke, as his father had been, and had even submitted to the government, but was still viewed with suspicion by the Crown's administration. 2 years later, in 1593, he was captured and put into Athlone prison under the charge of treason against English forces, along with Gráinne's half-brother Dornell, who was charged with the murder of some English soldiers. By that year, Gráinne's lands were being encroached on and her power was crumbling away. Now in her early 60s, she sent a petition to Queen Elizabeth I, asking her to grant her some reasonable maintenance for the little time she hath to live, as well as for the release of Tibbot. Gráinne also requested her sons and 2 of her Bourke nephews be given letters patent for their lands, basically government documents confirming their lands belonged to them. As a widow under English law, she also laid claim to lands from both of her 2 late husbands, pointing out that under Gaelic law, widows had no rights to any lands. The most amazing part of this was that Gráinne herself spoke for the men in her family, something which we can imagine Elizabeth might have rather liked, given her own position. Gráinne sailed to England to meet personally with Elizabeth on her own ship, but taking many male members of her family with her. She was sent a list of 18 questions or articles of interrogatory to answer before seeing the Queen, which Gráinne dutifully answered and returned, something that is an important source for much of the evidence we have about her. Legends have sprung up around the meeting of the Queen and Gráinne that are not mentioned in the historical records. This includes the story that Gráinne was found to be carrying a dagger, but when she said this was for her own protection, Elizabeth was apparently unconcerned and accepted this. This is highly unlikely given how rightfully paranoid Elizabeth was about plots on her life. Another story states that Gráinne sneezed and, being given a handkerchief to wipe with, threw it into the fire. To the shocked court, Gráinne explained that apparently in Ireland, a used hanky was considered dirty and was therefore destroyed. This was likely part of the horrible propaganda against the Irish that began with the English takeover of Ireland, and was a story used to attempt to show Gráinne as not like the English. It's much more likely that Gráinne, being a noblewoman, understood exactly how to turn up at court and simply met with the Queen properly dressed and mannered like any other courtier. The 2 women would also likely have spoken in English, as it was a language they both understood and could converse in, despite legends saying they spoke in Latin. Having said this, as an Irish noblewoman, Gráinne was possibly well educated and may have spoken Latin alongside her native Irish, and her travels may have also meant she spoke at least some Spanish and French as well as English. After their meeting, Elizabeth ordered her Privy Council to find out what Bingham had to say for himself. He apparently replied Gráinne was nurse to all rebellions in the province for this 40 years. Elizabeth wasn't impressed with this response, however, and she wrote back to Sir Richard telling him to comply with Gráinne's request and free her son and half-brother. She also ordered that out of the crown taxes her sons paid for their lands, provision should be made for Gráinne. However, the Irish government was slow in actually carrying out the Queen's orders, and Gráinne would have to make another visit in 1595 to ask again for the same. She had also offered in return the use of her galleys and men to fight for the Queen, and Gráinne would encourage her son Tibbot to do the same. By 1597, Tibbot had done enough to persuade the government to allow him the Mikeoem lands in his support for government troops. Without the slight hiccups regarding Sir Bingham, Gráinne's strategy to support the crown seemed to have prevailed. It was successful in the sense that Tibbot emerged by the end of the century as the biggest landowner in County Mayo and would later become a viscount. But it wasn't long before Gráinne's long and interesting life came to an end. We don't have an exact date of death for her, but she certainly died at some point in the first decade of the 17th century, possibly at Rockfleet Castle around 1603, although this is disputed. Gráinne left an amazing legacy of herself. She was the only woman from 16th century Ireland to be recorded in a leadership role, and she surpassed even this, becoming a fearless leader by land and sea, a shrewd politician, a rebel, a ruthless mercenary, and a protective and strong matriarch of her family. Gráinne was unique for her time and place. However, her importance within the politics of her native Northwest Ireland was relatively minor, as evidenced by the fact that there are no references to her at all in Gaelic historical sources. All the information we have about Gráinne comes from English historical sources. Nevertheless, Gráinne burned her memory into history through her actions, and she will forever be remembered by the iconic epithet, the Pirate Queen. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.